Portuguese or English, you can go to the website in PTTV, Workers' Party, and you can follow our broadcast in Portuguese and English. In Spanish, we are in the address at www.com/FES Brazil. This is the channel of Friedrich Ebert Foundation Brazil, whose partnership for so many years has been essential for us to start our activities. I will invite Christopher Heuser, representative of Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Brazil, for his initial greetings. Thank you for the presence, Christopher. And I want to thank you for this long-term partnership with the Workers' Party, and especially with us here in the Secretariat of the Environment. Christoph. Thank you, Nilto. And also I thank you for this long-term partnership that we have established between us, between the Foundation and the Workers' Party. So I'm really happy to have such a special activity today. Good afternoon, all of you who are here with us today. And also, I want to thank our federal representative, Nilto. This partnership is important, but also our struggle for the environment in Brazil is of essential importance. I want to also thank Fundação Perseu Abramo, Agnes, and also our colleagues in the technical area for allowing us to broadcast to the whole region. Events such as this are essential in this time. That's why it's my pleasure to also to greet the excellent speakers who are here with us. Said El-Khadraoui, David Livingstone, Camila Gramkow, and Marcos Fernandes. I'm also eager to hear from you. I'm really happy to have you with us today. Speaking of Brazil and effects of climate change, they are very apparent. We are living a critical situation, and also the consequences of a lack of a policy with the goal of protecting the environment. Much to the contrary, we see reduced resources dedicated to conservation, unheard of levels of deforestation, and also the ban of demarcation of indigenous lands. We have several examples of cases like this. We have been seeing this in the region, but not only here, but also all around the world. As we see in the last year, this race for economic growth has been destroying the environment. This is happening at accelerated pace instead of creating growth for everyone. It has led to more inequality, more social injustice that is becoming even more visible in the pandemic. So different reports show exactly like that. We have less and less time to act, and that's why we as FES, we believe that it's high time to open spaces of dialogue so we can rethink the economic model and the role of different states in this topic. We have promising examples such as the Green Deal or infrastructure initiative. What can we learn with these examples? That's exactly some points that we want to bring. So our foundation is committed to promote this debate and create networks to work together all around the world. We know that now it's the time to act all around the world, but specifically here in Brazil. So once again, I thank you for your participation. Thank you very much, specifically Newton, the translators who are also helping in this international exchange. And I thank you all. Very fruitful debate. Thank you, Christopher. And I want to thank you again for this common path that we are following in this construction of a just and more sustainable world. So the Workers' Party, the largest left-wing party in Latin America, founded by Lula da Silva, our president, our next president in Brazil, and by the Brazilian working class, the Workers' Party, who was created created by the civil society, the workers, the working class, and different sectors of our society, also carries in itself the environmental DNA since its creation. So I remember Chico Mendes, who will never be forgotten by us, one of the founders of the Workers' Party, and he left his legacy. The world has changed since the 1980s, when the Workers' Party was created and required more daring movements to understand our lives on Earth. That's why since 2018, the Workers' Party has seen the ecological transition as one of its top priorities. In 2020, we were able to advance in the construction of our manual, a manual that we publish every 2 years, is the PT ways of managing at different levels in the federal, state, and municipal governments. That's why this topic is gaining more and more space in the Workers' Party. And in this document, we described exactly the Workers' Party way of managing the country. This was reviewed, and the ecological transition is one of the structuring axes of our policies. More recently, but still last year, the party published a document called Plan for Reconstruction and Transformation of Brazil. And it's important to say that it's the only political party that throughout the period during the pandemic had the capacity to organize a robust document such as this with a number of different propositions to face the different contexts that we are living in Brazil, and also to think of ideas for the future of Brazil. In this document, the ecological transition also plays an important role as a tool to revert such a difficult moment of social and environmental destruction promoted by Bolsonaro administration. Since April of 2021, different centers of political and economic policies in Perseu Abramo Foundation and the Secretariat of the Development of the Workers' Party, together with FES, have been promoting different panels with themes as varied as races, the Amazon, sanitation, and the environment, in order to go deeper into these debates. This panel, Innovative Transition Strategies, Local Actions, and Global Impacts, will bring the 13th and last topic to be addressed throughout the cycle. And the final product is a workbook with the summary of the main debates that will be sent to the main thinkers and leaders of the Workers' Party to contribute to deepening our plan to reconstruct the country. In order to have this dialogue, we invited 4 thinkers and agents that will help us to understand further, as part of the globe has been positioning itself in face of the climate emergency. Each territory has its own peculiarities. That's why the content of this panel is essential for an exchange of different experiences coming from different regions and countries, and for sure will contribute with our aspect of thinking of the challenges that Brazil has to face based on these experiences. So I want to start by thanking the speakers that agreed to contribute to this debate promoted by our Secretariat of the Environment, the Workers' Party. So from Brazil, we have an officer of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Dr. Camila Gramkow, who was part of more than 30 projects of international cooperation, partnerships with Brazilian ministries and different agencies. Thank you, Camila, for accepting the invitation. And I invite you for your initial greetings. Good afternoon, Representative Nilto, Tatto. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank the Secretariat of the Environment for the invitation and congratulate you for the initiative of this discussion, which is absolutely essential. I want to take the opportunity to greet also the other speakers, Christopher, representative of FES, a partnership of CEPAL in this discussion for a drive for sustainability, and I want also to greet David, Marco, and Said. It will be a pleasure to have you here with us today. And for North America, directly from the Office for the Climate, from the President of the United States, David Livingstone, Senior Counselor for the Presidential Office for the Climate in the United States, who has been worked already with Eurasia Group and the World Trade Organization in the UN. Thank you, David Livingstone. Thank you for accepting the invitation. David, you have the floor. David, we invite you for your initial remarks.
Yes, apologies. I was just having a slight technical difficulty. Apologies for that. And I'm so glad to be able to join you all today. Thank you for having me. As you know, someone who's working on a range of different issues, along with Secretary Kerry in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, let me just say that we value deeply the relationship between the United States and Brazil, and of course the many and manifold opportunities to advance climate action, to advance a cleaner economy, to advance the global energy transition that we need to see in order to avoid the climate crisis. Those two large, diversified economies, major agricultural producers, major producers of fossil fuels, the United States and Brazil have a significant role to play in decarbonization at home, but also have an opportunity to work together in the years ahead to galvanize international cooperation. Frame that up, I thought I would give just a few remarks about the way that the United States is working on international climate diplomacy, and to give a little bit more information about our international climate objectives and how we're going about carrying those forward. Our international climate objectives divide roughly into three different clusters, three different pillars, as I like to say. The first is getting the United States back in the game, back on track, after several years of, if we're being frank with one another, not being at the table and not being in a leadership role on climate, as so many around the world have wanted to see and desperately need. Number two is exercising US leadership. And number three is, of course, raising global climate ambition. Of course, there's overlap among these. They're not narrowly siloed. The more we do domestically, the more ability we have to push to do things internationally as well. And the more we can use leadership of what we're doing at home to try and press others to raise ambition around the world. Let me dive first, though, into pillar one, getting the United States back on track. You might think about this alternatively as getting our own house in order. From day one, President Biden has committed to a strong signal of leadership on climate change. In just his first few hours in the Oval Office, President Biden signed the paperwork necessary to get the United States back into the Paris Agreement. And the United States rejoined the Paris Agreement officially as of February 19th of this year. Of course, that's not enough. We also need to come back to Paris with a level of ambition that sets a tone for the sort of player internationally that the United States is going to be on climate change. We did that with a dramatically enhanced nationally determined contribution, a climate commitment within the Paris framework, if you will, 2030 climate commitment. It will see the United States reduce emissions, setting a goal of reducing emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. That's a dramatic improvement on the Obama era climate commitments made just several years before. And it will be an all-out effort across the entire US economy, across all sectors, the power sector, industry, agriculture, transport, and beyond, in order to reach those goals. Of course, in doing so, we're going to create many jobs,
criar muitos empregos,
and we're going to advance
e vamos avançar
our interests and our a number of U.S. strategic priorities, as well as those of like-minded partners and allies. Now, in addition, it's not just about what we've done in terms of our Paris commitment within the Paris framework. We've also taken several complementary actions to advance this as well. We've developed and announced a climate finance plan to help other countries deal with the fallout of climate change and to put them in a stronger position to also take actions to address climate change in their own economies. President Biden's climate finance plan would see a doubling of US climate finance, literally taking it to 2x. And it would have a special focus on adaptation, which would see adaptation finance tripling, even as overall climate finance doubles. It's a strong down payment on the sort of active leadership that the United States wants to take. In addition to this, there have been several other strong signals sent by this White House and this administration. One of President Biden's first executive orders was an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It sets a tone for the way that the US international energy posture, our positions at multilateral development banks, our financing posture, the way we engage diplomatically and commercially abroad will pivot from a focus on fossil fuels and polluting fuels to really driving in as inclusive a way possible, all hands on deck clean energy transition strategy that will help other countries achieve their climate goals, accelerate the global energy transition, and by the way, will create significant value and opportunities in attractive, fast-growing sectors for American workers and for workers all around the world. Now, in terms of US leadership, that second pillar that I highlighted at the beginning, well, I think the fact that I'm speaking to you today is evidence of, the down payment we put on US leadership. I work in the office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change. The United States has had special envoys for climate change before that sat at the State Department. They've never before had one that reports directly to the President of the United States, that also has a seat on the National Security Council, nor one which has the gravitas, the experience, and the depth of expertise and profile, such as someone like Secretary Kerry, who's already served as Secretary of State. It's a strong signal of the prioritization put on addressing the climate crisis by this administration. Now, in addition to that, you can also see it in the manifest single most prominent foreign policy priority of the first 100 days of this administration, the single largest foreign policy engagement of this administration. It was a summit, the Leaders Summit on Climate, that was convened by President Biden, that brought together within the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration, 40 leaders representing the major economy, a reconvening of the Major Economies Forum and the countries in the Major Economies Forum, plus several other heads of state from small countries that are innovating climate solutions, some of the least developed and most vulnerable countries, small island states whose literal existence is at risk from how we deal with the climate crisis. And we had 40 heads of state. In addition to that, over 60 ministers who joined in various other policy roundtables and focused discussion in conversations ranging from decarbonizing transport, driving forward the innovations we'll need for deep decarbonization in the decades ahead, climate finance, equity and inclusion, just transitions, and beyond. Now, in addition to all of this, of course, we also have taken actions to elevate climate in other fora, the International Maritime Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the OECD, the Arctic Council, and beyond. The signal that we've sent by having all these cabinet secretaries from across the administration, not just my boss, Secretary Kerry, but also Secretary Vilsack and Buttigieg and Secretary Yellen, our U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, our Energy Secretary, Secretary Granholm, and beyond. All of them were at the Leaders Summit on Climate and sent the message that this is not just a job for the climate-focused elements of the administration, that climate is a cross-cutting priority of every single cabinet agency, every single part of the Biden-Harris administration. And we continue to do that by raising climate in other fora where it's going to impact our ability to deliver inclusive and shared economic prosperity and growth in the years ahead. It's going to be critical to our ability to tackle the next generation of foreign policy challenges, climate-driven refugee flows, fires, catastrophes, floods, and beyond. Now, finally, I want to talk about raising global climate ambition. This is our third pillar. We left in 2015 having cemented the Paris Agreement, strong action towards limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C as a shared goal coming out of the Paris Agreement, and with efforts, aspirational efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Now, the science continues to tell us that we were on the right track with including that 1.5 degrees C, because indeed it's more critical than ever before, the science tells us, to keep warming to no more than 1.5 degrees C if we hope to avoid the worst damages of climate change. Our goal for this year's COP, and indeed for several of the other important gatherings like the G7, which has already taken place, the G20 Leaders Summit, which is coming up, OECD, future convenings in the Major Economies Forum and beyond, is to make clear that we need substantial progress towards keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach. Now, we can do that through net zero goals of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, mid-century. We can do that through 2030 NDC targets, 2030 Paris commitments, which are ambitious and aligned with keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach. We can do that through strong actions by non-state actors, subnational entities, tribes, corporations, universities, civil society organizations, and other communities that are committed to keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach, that are committed to trajectories consistent with net zero by 2050, and through other multi-stakeholder initiatives. We're working assiduously, bilaterally and multilaterally, to get countries, and particularly the world's largest economies, the major economies around the world, take additional steps. We left President Biden's climate summit with a little bit more perhaps than 50% of global GDP aligned with keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach. When you look at the long-term 2050 as well as the shorter-term 2030 ambitions and commitments of those countries. But the fastest growing portion of global GDP, even if it's a little bit less than 50%, the fastest growing chunk of global GDP is not yet 1.5 degrees C aligned. That's our great challenge. That's where we need to work together. That's where we need to paint a picture in which climate action is not a trade-off with economic growth. It's an accelerator of economic growth, of green, shared, inclusive prosperity in the decades ahead. Our office, Secretary Kerry, and the entire Biden-Harris administration is working tirelessly around the clock to try and deliver greater commitments, greater ambition, and greater action in this critical decade ahead to paint this picture. We have a decade in which we can go from the idea of green growth the idea of net zero aligned prosperity, and we can actually make it a reality. We can actually create true, compelling case studies within countries, within states, within localities, within economies all around the world. And we have to work together to do that. Thank you for having me. Thanks for allowing me to paint a picture of what the Biden-Harris administration is engaged in thus far. And I look forward to hearing some of the other remarks and engaging in the conversation to come. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, David. Fica aqui com a
Thank you,
gente.
David. Stay with us. There will be a questions and answers session. We very much look forward to that. So now I want to, instead of having these brief greetings we thought of initially, I'm going to call Camila right away for her presentation. Camila, please. Thank you once again, Congressman. I'm going to go straight to my talk. I'm going to concentrate my remarks on two main axes. The first is about the context, why it is relevant to discuss sustainability questions, ecological transformation, whatever the terminology you choose to use. And the second part, to present to you an approach that we've been developing at ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the UN, called the Big Push to Sustainability. So let's go. Where are we? Why is this debate today relevant? We, Brazil, Latin American countries in the Caribbean, we're going through a very serious situation, a global crisis, health crisis, social crisis, economic crisis without precedent in this century. But this crisis, it sort of lands, so to speak, in Latin America and the Caribbean at a moment, at a time, at a circumstance of deep gaps in our development. The fact that this crisis arrived in a country with major fragilities in the economic, social, and environmental pillars means that the magnitude of the effects of the crisis are amplified. And more than that, deepen these development gaps. So in the economic pillar, Latin America and the Caribbean were already having a very low level of economic dynamism in the last 5 years before the pandemic, 14 to 19. The average GDP growth in Brazil was 0.4%, 0.4, so very weak. So not a very robust figure at all. In the environment, in the social pillar, we were observing an increase in poverty, extreme poverty, and inequality. And in the environmental pillar, the growing emissions of greenhouse gases, destruction of native species, etc. So the pandemic arrived in this context and worsened all of them. So if we look at the economic impact of the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean, it brought about a contraction of 6.8% of GDP last year. This is a very serious figure. It's the biggest drop in at least 1 century. We have to go back to the impacts of the First World War to have a similar comparable. And in 1930, there was a drop of 5%. That was a very serious repercussion of the Wall Street crash. So in Brazil in particular, it was just over 4%, which was slightly better. But Brazil made a major effort, fiscal effort, with emergency aid for the people that accounting for about 5% of GDP last year alone. So Here at ECLAC, we think that the pandemic will tend to generate an increase, an addition of 22 million people living in extreme poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in Brazil, about 9 million extra poor people. So this is one of the severe facets or cruel facets of the pandemic. And if we look at the environmental pillar, although in the very short term the pandemic may have alleviated in some respects air pollution, for instance, from less circulation of vehicles, etc. We have some studies about that. So this reduction in the peaks. In the peaks of social isolation, it was down, pollution was down by 25%. But now they're back to normal. The emissions are back to pre-pandemic levels and are even above the pre-pandemic levels, because in many places, some environmental norms have been suspended under the pretext of economic recovery. So in some respects, it is worse now. But we have to think about a new style of development. So at ECLAC, we use the expression to characterize this discussion that we need a recovery, transformative recovery. We cannot have a recovery back to the past. We need a recovery that is transformative, and the meaning of the transformation that we want is sustainability and equality. So that is the debate that we put before ourselves. And before I tell you a little bit more about this approach that we've been developing, I want to also comment on the context, in the sense that there has been little action in this direction that we have been proposing. If we look at the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, the expenditure in recovery, brown recovery as we say, was much greater than the green expenses, a proportion of 4-to-1. So for every dollar spent in green recovery, 4 was spent in brown recovery. So this is something that we have to change, of course, to be able to have a sustainable recovery. And the survey that was made by Oxford shows that $51 billion that the Latin American countries spent to reactivate their economies, less than 3%, 2.9% were green initiatives. So these data show that it's important to reinforce, to strengthen the reactivation packages, but directing them in a coherent way, convergent with what David just said, of thinking about the kind of energy we want for the economic recovery. Made the big push for sustainability is the approach that ECLAC has been developing to support the countries of the region to develop strategies for a transformative, sustainable recovery with equality. So we can divide this approach in 3 main axes, 3 axes of analysis. The first is a diagnosis about the styles or models of development. I've already talked a little bit about that in the context. This diagnosis, to really boil it down, the idea is to look at the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, and to evaluate how the development model is operating in this regard. And as we saw, with regard to Latin American and Caribbean countries, including Brazil, there is major frailty in all 3 pillars, even before the pandemic. So the pandemic made these frailties even more visible: inequality, poverty, environmental degradation, high levels of informality in the labor market, social marginalization, how much this exposes the countries to further vulnerabilities in a moment of economic crisis. The second axis of analysis, looking forward. So what is the future going forward that awaits us? And this axis of analysis breaks down into two. One is one way to look at the future. What will be the future if we persist in the same policies of the past, the same sectors of the past, the same practices of consumption, of production of the past? In other words, what are the consequences of inaction? So I want to remind ourselves, perhaps one of the biggest economists in Latin America, who was Raul Prebisch, he has a sentence which to me is very symbolic of this axis of analysis of inaction. He wrote a text called the Environmental Text in 1980, environmental crisis in 1980, when there was scarce data and evidence, but Prebisch already could see the relevance of this question. He said, we are not facing new problems, but old problems that have become more serious. I think this sentence makes it very clear that the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, has been worsening other problems of development, particularly inequality, because as we know, global warming tends to impact disproportionately the most vulnerable populations who are more exposed to risk. In the case of Brazil, for instance, where we have in the setting of much warmer planetary temperature, this can lead to the disappearance of yucca, which can grow in poor soils with low rainfall, and it's fundamental for the food security of the northeastern population of Brazil, for instance. So in this axis, we look at the cost of inaction. So inaction has a cost. If we don't confront, if we don't deal with, address the climate emergency, doesn't mean that things will stay as they are. They will keep getting worse. There will be significant costs. And to put this into perspective, if the crisis in Brazil, the pandemic, last year, there was a 4.2% economic contraction. The economic cost to our GDP of not controlling global warming would be 5 to 20% contraction for several years in a row of major economic losses, with a potential to completely disrupt, completely disorganize, to destructure the economy. In line with what we saw in the IPCC recently launched a report of major consequences of inaction.
The third axis, that is the main one, as I told you first, is the diagnosis from the past, the development styles, and the diagnosis for the future in terms of the inaction. The third leg, the big push for sustainability, is the axis of propositions. What is the future that we want to bring? And this axis for the future that we want to bring, we put the sustainability and equality, and also important focus on this approach based on investments. Investment is the major variable in this approach of the big push for two main reasons. The first is that investments have a great capacity in the short term to contribute to the economic rebounds, to generate jobs, to generate income. So there is the capacity of giving traction to the economy. And it is the variable that carries in itself the link between the short and the long term. So the investments today explain the economic model of tomorrow. This is the reason of this focus on investments, and Then we have to determine what are the investments that we will analyze. We have identified 8 sectors that has the capacity, the ability to bring benefits in these 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. I'm going to mention the sectors first: transformation of the energy matrix, the energy transition, sustainable mobility, sustainable urban spaces, the digital revolution for sustainability, the economy of care that gains a huge importance. We see this especially during the pandemic, the bioeconomy, the circular economy, and sustainable tourism, which is specifically important for the countries in the Caribbean. So what is the big push? Why is it called the big push? So I don't want to bring a lot of theory, but rather examples to understand where this idea comes from. The theory of the big push says that development does not happen little by little. It calls to emphasize this point. There's no use in creating a program here, another there. You invest only in one sector, but to do it little by little, or believing that taking small steps we are going to reach good level of development and inequality is something that is not accepted by the theory. So the big push works with the assumption that we will only have development if we have really a big push of investment. Investments with 2 main characteristics. First, the scale. We can only change the development model and give this development leap with a big volume of investments. And the second characteristic is exactly to have investments that add to each other, complementary investments. This is the beauty of the theory. And what is this idea of this complementary nature? When we talk about a deep transformation, we see that one sector is only economically viable when we have simultaneous investment in other sectors. And we try to bring this discussion to the area of sustainability, to bring this example of the complementary nature of investments. There's no use in investing in electrical vehicles if it's not going to be profitable, if we don't have at the same time investment in the structure to recharge these vehicles. And the opposite is true as well. So this complementary nature shows that this is a systemic question. We need to have massive investments in different sectors simultaneously. I'm aware that I only have a few minutes to close, but I wanted to bring some of the main points of this approach, which are things that are relevant for our discussion. Another analysis that we are living that is central to this conversation, we have partners from the United States, China, and we must sit down and think of this problem of a global nature. But in addition to this global solution, global heating, global warming is a global problem. We cannot reduce emissions only in one country. We need coordination, so it implies a global coordination. And in addition to that, in addition to this issue of effectively reducing emissions at a global scale, our estimates point out to policies to encourage sustainable investments in Latin American countries and around the world. So our scenarios, the scenarios that we run, say that in all of them, we have positive impacts for GDP and for employment, for trade, a number of positive socioeconomic effects in all of them. But the scenarios that bring the most positive effects are the scenarios with a global coordination. So, if, for example, countries in Latin America will decide, if they decide to run green actions, there will be benefits, of course. But these impacts will be much more highlighted if the whole world moves into the same direction. All the countries are coordinated together to have a strategy of recovery, to transform the economy, focusing on this economic rebounds with technologies in different sectors, in any more sustainable practices. Another interesting impact that came from our analysis, when we have isolated actions versus coordinated actions, we see that only in the scenarios with international coordination, we have significant impacts in the reduction of inequality. This is extremely important. So to close, because I know that I'm almost out of time, I wanted to bring some examples on how we are landing this approach, this consensual framework. I want to thank FES for the partnership. We have common projects in some areas. We have already worked together in on a program on gender equality. On September 9th, we are going to launch our new report about the big push and employment, try to understand how sustainable investment in different areas, in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture in the Amazon, how this set of sustainable investment will generate jobs and what kinds of jobs. And to close with two examples, one of the cases that we consider of big push for sustainability in Brazil is the fast expansion of wind energy that brought investments of millions of dollars to Brazil. This is a chain that was developed in less than a decade. Brazil did not have this capacity, did not have this technology, but was able to internalize that. Today, we estimate that this chain generates more than 150,000 jobs. And another example that we analyzed in Rio Grande do Sul, the investment in agricultural forest models. We have different reports telling how much these schemes help to improve competitiveness. In Rio Grande do Sul, in the south of Brazil, it was applying the production of tea. In the areas that installed this system saw an increase in productivity that was transformed into an additional income of $2,500 per year per family. So it's really important for more sustainable practice. But I don't want to exceed my time. I want to thank you for the opportunity, and we can continue during our Q&A and debate. Thank you, Camila. Yes, please remain with us for the final round. I'm really excited to make comments and ask questions, but I must stick to my role here. Camila said that in order to reduce emissions, there's no use in having only some countries running actions. The same thing is true for the big push. It must be global investment, the strategic role of the state. Maybe we have a big push on the part of developed countries, but the others don't do it. And so it won't happen. These are the challenges of this debate. And also to know what's happening in Europe and to bring representatives of Europe to the debate, I want to invite Said Khadraoui.
Hello, good evening.
Here he is a former member of the European Parliament, today special counselor for the European Community for Progressive Studies, a thinker, a counselor of the European New Deal. Thank you for the presence. Welcome, Said. Thank you for your contribution, for being with us here. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for this very timely discussion. The latest IPCC report, it was referred to already, showed clearly once again the sense of urgency. We are in a climate crisis and we are in it together. And everybody needs to cooperate and learn from each other. And that's why I think this is a very useful conversation. Before diving into the latest development in the European Union, I would like to emphasize the need to look at the intersections between environment and social considerations. Camila referred already to it. In and of themselves, global warming and the gradual degradation of our environment generate a wide range of social challenges. The most vulnerable people suffer first and most. This is happening at the global level. It's often poorer countries that will suffer more from climate change, but this applies also within each of our countries, also in the European Union. This is the case. And this is because vulnerable people live in places where, where they may be exposed to floods, or because they live in houses that are badly insulated, or because they cannot afford air conditioning during extreme heat waves, or because good healthcare and healthy food becomes increasingly expensive. And by contrast, it is the richest segments of the population that are contributing most to higher emissions due to their consumption patterns. They tend to occupy larger living spaces, they have higher energy use and meat consumption, they travel further by car and by plane, for instance. So we have to absorb these additional social risks so that we can adapt to the new reality, which is a hotter planet, because even if we take action fast and accelerate it, we will have to deal with the more disruptive weather patterns. And failing to take action is therefore not an option for progressives, right? But taking ambitious measures, on the other hand, is also likely to have social implications, because the cost of climate policies may affect vulnerable groups more than others. Pricing the negative externalities of products and services, which is key if you want to change behavior of people, or phasing out unsustainable practices may actually disproportionately affect lower income households because they spend relatively more on energy, for example, or because the necessary investments are unaffordable. And at the same time, that is something we see in our countries, subsidies to promote innovative and sustainable technologies, such as electric cars or solar panels, are often taken up first by wealthy and middle-class citizens, creating wealth transfers away from those in need. It doesn't have to be like that. But I just want to make the point that policymakers everywhere will have to integrate this complexity, let's say, in the design of climate policies from day one. So these policies need to be ambitious, but at the same time also very smart. Now, coming to the EU, I think it's fair to say that the EU developed over the years a number of instruments. It's not new. These instruments help us today in the European Union to accelerate climate action by updating, improving these existing tools. I give you just one example. Since 2005, we have already an emission trading system in place that covers all the important industrial installations and the energy sector. And I will say a little bit more about that later. And we adopted also, many years ago already, targets to be achieved with regard to the use of renewable energy or energy efficiency. by 2020, by 2030, and a whole range of policy instruments to help achieve these targets. And we were able actually in Europe to reduce our emissions already by 24% today compared to 1990, and at the same time keep growing our economy. But the point is, this is not sufficient, and we need to accelerate right now. And it's probably the 2015 Paris Agreement that prepared the ground for a repositioning of climate at the heart of EU policymaking, culminating in the launch of what we call the European Green Deal in December 2019. It was the very first big initiative announced by the European Commission, that is the kind of the executive arm of the European Union, at the very start of this political cycle. And the European Green Deal was in the first place a narrative. It was a vision about the future, with the explicit ambition to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. But it included also an impressive list of actions to be rolled out between 2020 and 2024. And in 2020, last year, despite the COVID-19 crisis, a number of sub-strategies and action plans were launched to clarify the way forward for a number of building blocks of this Green Deal. For instance, how to achieve a more resource-efficient circular economy, proposals on or a sub-strategy on transport, another one on the food system, on biodiversity. We also launched a renovation wave that should help us to increase the pace of renovations of our building stock in order to insulate houses better, make them more energy efficient. We also launched a just transition mechanism to help finance the reconversion of regions that rely on coal or have a lot of energy intensive industries. We also launched a new industrial strategy because policymakers start to realize that this transition will actually disrupt and transform all industrial sectors, like for instance the automotive industry. And you need to plan ahead. You need to prepare for that change. And for instance, create a battery value chain, you know, to help create new jobs. We need also to help people reskill and find jobs in new sectors. So all in all, you could say that it's really becoming a very comprehensive package of policies, right? It's about systemic change. It's actually about rethinking the socio-economic model. And I must say I'm very much attracted by the donut model provided by Kate Raworth, a British economist who designed a framework in the form of a donut, explaining that we should develop an economy that stays within the planetary boundaries, that does not overshoot, make sure that we do not contribute to biodiversity loss and of course not to climate change. But at the same time, this same economy needs to be designed in such a way that we also create the social foundations, right? To give people access to water, to food, to education, to housing. And so finding that balance is the very difficult task that is ahead of us. And of course, to get there, we need a lot of money.
Juntos,
we need to finance the transition.
Precisamos de dinheiro para financiar a transição.
In parallel to many...
Então, em paralelo...
Sorry, I hear now the Portuguese translation. So, in parallel to many ideas and plans, the EU budget has put more focus on supporting climate policies, also for external action, make it aligned, let's say, with our objectives when we speak with our partners worldwide. In the EU, you may know we have a very strange way of constructing the budget. Every 7 years, there is a negotiation between the member states and the European Commission and the European Parliament to agree on how to spend European money. And This resulted in a deal about the distribution of 1,000 billion euros that is available between 2021 and 2028. It sounds a lot of money, but it's only 1% of EU GDP. So much more of the investment money, of course, need to be done at the level of the member states, right? But it's not negligible. And there was the agreement that, for instance, 30% of this 1,000 billion for the next coming years will have to be spent and earmarked for climate action, used for research, for infrastructure, and so on. We are also, in parallel, transforming the European Union's development bank, the European Investment Bank, into a climate bank that is refocusing its lending policies towards climate projects. And of course, next to public money, we also need to reorient private capital flows. And that's why we developed what we call a sustainable finance agenda, with a wide range of measures that are being designed and implemented in order to, nudge private investors towards more long-term societal objectives. For instance, we are creating what we call a taxonomy of green activities. It's a kind of a dictionary that explains what type of projects, what type of activities are green and what are not green, right? So that we speak the same language and can increase also transparency. Companies will have to disclose much better also non-financial issues, not only how much they earn or spend, but also how much they emit in emissions and other environmental externalities and so on. All of this will help to, a number of actors in the finance value chain to develop credible green financial products and instruments, avoid greenwashing, help, for instance, also rating agency to do benchmarking, to compare companies, whether they are, supporting the green transition or not. So this is an indirect way that can be really impactful. And it's not only an EU issue. This will have to be globalized. There are different discussions ongoing, of course, and we need to discuss with each other how we can create really a more fair financial system globally. As I said earlier, all of this coincides with the COVID-19 crisis. And the question at the time was a bit whether the COVID crisis would slow down the efforts we do on climate, or on the contrary, help to accelerate action. And I think, as a matter of fact, maybe paradoxically, so far it seems to help climate action, and it's kept on the political agenda. I give you just one example. The COVID crisis triggered an EU-wide recovery measure. In addition to the budget I already mentioned, the European Union created a fund of 750 billion euros that will be redistributed by the member states, who are obliged to design plans that include at least 37% climate projects. And in addition, we also introduced the concept of no harm, meaning that funding for non-climate projects can in no case harm climate objectives. So that's also a kind of a test that is going to be made every time money is spent. Another important decision, let's say, or initiative that is crucial for the longer term was the launch and also adoption of the European climate law. Just a few months ago, the European Parliament and the member states agree with that European climate law. It sets the frame for the EU's climate-related legislations for the 30 years to come. It makes the objective of climate neutrality in the EU by 2050 a binding objective, but it also includes a new collective net greenhouse gas emission reduction target of at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990, up from the minus 40% that existed already today. So we are accelerating, and this European climate law makes it binding. And it also includes some of the mechanics that should keep us on track in future. For instance, this climate law foresees the obligation to assess every 5 years where we are with regard to climate and adjust policies where needed. And the adoption of the climate law was important for the next big thing that happened this summer, just a few weeks ago. It was the launch of what we call in Europe the Fit for 55 package. I mentioned the new objective to achieve by the European Union. It is to reduce our emissions by 55%. Well, this package contains the proposals that should help us achieve that ambition. And at the heart of it is a reform of the emission trading system I mentioned already. It basically obliges companies from the sectors covered by the system to have allowances per ton CO2 their installations emit. And the price is defined by the market. And until 2-3 years ago, these prices were very, very low. But now they reached almost 60 euros per ton. And this creates incentives for companies to avoid paying this and to invest rather in new clean technologies. And this has had remarkable success already, but now the total amount of allowances is going to reduce every year, and this rate of reduction will accelerate by 4.2% every year. And this means that there will be a scarcity of allowances, and therefore the price will rise further, and therefore incentives to invest in new technologies will increase. And the scope is also expanding. I mentioned that we have already a system in place since many years, but now we're going to include also the maritime sector, so that shipping companies will have to pay a carbon price if they want to reach the European Union. A key difficulty here, and that is relevant for our discussion today, is of course that by increasing the carbon price for production of goods in the EU, there is a risk of what we call carbon leakage. The risk that EU companies are outcompeted or shift production to outside Europe and pollute elsewhere, and then we would not have lower emissions neither. And so today this problem is partially addressed by the fact that companies that face international competition receive a number of free allowances. But this will be phased out in the new proposals when a new mechanism will be phased in. And that's the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism that introduces a carbon price on imported goods equal to the price paid by European companies through the ETS system, the emission trading system, unless these products have been produced in a place where some form of equivalent carbon pricing system exists already. And it will apply the first few years, only to a limited number of specific, very energy-intensive products like cement, aluminium, steel, etc., etc. Clearly, this will have to be discussed at the global level with our partners from other countries, because I understand will create some level of tension and discussions, and we need to find ways to cooperate with third countries on how we need to implement this measure. A more controversial measure, and I'm almost at the end of my summary of where we are in the European Union, a more controversial measure for inside the European Union is the introduction of an emission trading system for fuels used in housing and road transport sector. And this will, of course, somehow raise the prices of fuels, because the idea is being that fossil fuels for heating, for instance, should be replaced by heat pumps and other technologies. But there is the danger that vulnerable people will be affected more than others, and that it may trigger energy poverty. And so that is why this same proposal is complemented with the creation of a social climate fund that will use part of the revenues from the auctioning of the allowances paid by the fuel suppliers. And the member states will have to draft a social plan in which they explain how they will use the revenues and the social climate fund, basically, to give direct support to vulnerable people and help households to invest in new heating installations, for instance. So this will certainly be controversial and be discussed, and we don't know yet what will be the final outcome. Other proposals of this Fit for 55 package are about renewable energy, energy efficiency, rules on energy taxation to promote cleaner fuels, measures to accelerate the electrification of transport, and so on. This package now is on the table, but this is not the end. It's rather the beginning of a journey, because it needs to be negotiated with the member states and with the European Parliament. But because we now have this European climate law that makes our commitments binding, in one way or another, we will have to achieve our objectives. And maybe some parts of what I explained will change in the next year or so during the negotiations, but it will have to be replaced by something that is equally effective and impactful. So I stop here. I would be very happy to continue the conversation and to hear questions and try to respond as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Khadraoui.
Thank you, Said. Stay with us. Please do take part in the Q&A. I'm going to abstain from commenting here to stay with my role as the chair. So I want to invite our friend and comrade Marco Fernandes, who is living currently in China. He's a researcher of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Since 2005, has been a member of the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil and the Via Campesina Global Network. I want to say a special thank you, Via Campesina and the Tricontinental Institute, for putting us in touch, Marco. And the challenge that we want from you is, what is China doing to confront the climate crisis? So you are on the other side of the world. It's of course very late where you are. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. Marco, you have the floor. Go ahead. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. Our comrade, Congressman Nilto Tatto, we've been in the trenches for decades in our country, of course. I want to say a special thank you for the initiative, the invitation, the opportunity to learn from your very rich contributions from different parts of the world, and also to say thank you for my fellow panelists, all the technicians, all the workers behind the scenes, the workers of the Workers' Party who are making this event happen. Thank you also, Friedrich Ebert Foundation. So firstly, I want to apologize because it's already 3:20 in the morning. So my energy level has dropped significantly in comparison with 3:20 in the afternoon. I have a little cup of coffee here to help me with that. So perhaps this will not be a glowing performance. Okay, here we go. First thing, the question has already been mentioned by more than one of my fellow panelists. It's clear that this question, the environmental question, has reached a limit. We are already living experiencing more environmental tragedies all over the world, and it's clear, and this was underlined by the pandemic, underscored by the pandemic, that it's the kind of problem that we will only solve with cooperation. So in this regard, perhaps the two main news items in the last few months, one, as representative of the US government just mentioned, was the return of the US to the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. This was celebrated globally, of course, because it's not possible to overcome the challenges, the battles of global warming without the cooperation of the United States. And another major event happening was in September of last year, when China, President Xi announced a very ambitious target, and to a certain extent unexpected target, which was to reach the 2030 peak of carbon emissions and the neutrality in 2060. So at the time when this was broadcast, there was, the headlines for weeks on end, and it was complemented by many Western specialists, experts in the US and Europe, because clearly China is another protagonist in this battle. So China today emits about 28% of carbon dioxide in the world. So without China managing to solve this problem domestically, we will not shift as a world. It's important as well to understand this question with a certain level of relativism, because it's true that China emits 28% of the world's carbon, but it produces 28% of the industrial products of the world. For example, half the coal and the cement used on the planet. So an example of how the production and emission of China, it's not only China's responsibility, it's also a responsibility of 200 countries that have trading relations with China, who also benefit from this production. So another reason why China will not be able to solve this problem by itself. So what has China done? China has a major problem, which is well known, which is the high levels of use of coal-fired energy. So 58% of China's energy is from coal-fired power plants. That's the big villain, so to speak, of Chinese emissions. What is China doing about that? Well, China has a transition plan. There's one thing that when they announce a target, it means it's serious. If there's a plan, it's a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. In this case, it's 2060. Their horizon is 2060. So China has a target until 2025. Today, it uses 15% of its energy is renewable. 15. The target in the next 4 years to go from 15 to 25 of renewable energy. So this is an ambitious target in itself. What is China doing to achieve this? They're doing a lot. China, in recent years, has become the biggest producer and investor and consumer of renewable energy in the world. China spent, in the last decade, China spent $800 billion in investing in renewable energy. So, for example, China is the biggest investor in R&D on renewable energies. Spent in 2018, that's the last data we have, $250 billion. So the US, which is the second biggest, spent $140 billion, the second biggest investor. The US has more quality in its research. The United States is the biggest reference. The papers, the research is still number one, but China is number two in certain fields. Some subfields, they are already overcoming the United States in R&D. So regarding renewable energy. So what we see is that China has taken a series of steps with the aim of advancing towards its neutrality by 2060. And if we look at all the items from the point of view of alternative energy, China is doing a lot in many fields. Just a couple of examples.
Wind energy and solar energy. Well, China is also standing out on a global basis due to technology, the low costs, and the speed in which they are implementing both of these forms of energy in their country. Last year, China has doubled their capacity. In 1 year, they doubled their capacity of wind and solar energy. For example, they produce today 80% of the silicon that is used in solar panels. And this has also made the average price of solar panels to drop, thanks to the acceleration of the Chinese production. So to give you an idea, 1/3 of the solar panels and the wind turbines in the world are in China today. So, of course, China has been becoming a major player in the use of renewable energies. Silicon, yes, because in Portuguese it's different. Also, 80% of the silicon used in solar panels is produced in China. China, from the point of view of electrical vehicles, is another front in this battle to reduce the emissions of fossil fuels engines. China today is one of the global centers of the production of electric cars. Today, they have half of the electric cars in the world. In China, for example, recently Tesla has built a gigantic plant of more than $1 billion. Tesla today is one of the major producers of electrical cars. And China has done something that was very smart. They brought Tesla with incentives. Tesla was the first car producer that was able to enter China without having to form a joint venture with a Chinese partner. So this was a benefit that the Chinese government provided to Tesla. But what is the reasoning? In bringing Tesla, Tesla will build all of the industrial facilities to produce all the parts, to produce an electric car. They have a high level of technology and production. And these electrical facilities will help to upgrade all the other Chinese facilities. So it's not by chance. Today, the press published that the largest producer in China of electric cars, they are signaling that next year they will they will pass Tesla in terms of the production of electric cars. Of course, the Tesla cars are more expensive, they're more sophisticated, but this shows that the entry of Tesla is already helping to develop the Chinese electrical cars. So for us, it's clear that a number of sectors, from nuclear energy, for example, last year China has achieved for the first time, they were able to have energy sovereignty in the electric sector. They have been learning, they have been transferring technology from the United States and France for more than 20 years. And for the first time last year, they were able to develop the Hualong system, which is the Chinese system that will start to be exported for the countries very soon. Hydropower plants also. China, 2 months ago, China has started the first turbines of the second largest hydropower plant in the world. The first is also a Chinese hydropower plant. This will be the second largest, with a turbine of 1 gigawatt, the largest turbine ever built for hydropower plants. So from this point of view, there's evidence that China will play this role. And of course, countries in the global south, they need countries such as Argentina and Mexico. They need to be more attentive. We need to build strategic partnerships with China as well, in addition to United States and Europe that have like a long-term experience in renewable energies. China in the recent years has become like a big player. Another area where China has been standing out is in reforestation as well. Part of the goals for 2060 have to do with a massive reforestation campaigns in the country. And the Chinese environment was very much damaged in the last 40 years due to the acceleration of the economic industrial acceleration in China. But once again, they are very much aware of it. In the Chinese society, it's not only the government, but the Chinese society is putting pressure on the government to reach this goal. So to give an idea, China between 1990 and 2020, China was responsible for 25% of the new green areas in the world. And this takes into consideration forests and pastures. For many years, China has been working, and this data comes from NASA, satellites that are permanently measuring the green areas in the world. So China is standing out due to their commitment and their capacity to reforest and rebuild their environment that was very much damaged. So from this point of view, also, from the point of view of international cooperation, China has also a lot of experience to bring to the countries of the global south. So I'm about to conclude. And I invite you to think from the point of view of Brazil, because I'm not Chinese. I'm a Brazilian researcher interested in understanding this phenomenon of climate change and specifically what China has been doing to fight that and how this can affect the countries of the global south, specifically also Latin American Brazil. So touching on the element of green areas and reforestation, China, one of the proposals, well, I think that you all know, last year China has also met a very ambitious goal that was to eliminate extreme poverty in the country. This was a great victory for the Chinese people. This is a program, a specific program. This last phase between 2013 to 2020 with Xi Jinping as president already, 100 million people left extreme poverty. But one specific point that was done with the methods that they use was exactly what they call ecological offsetting, which is a number of measures that connected the fight against poverty with the fight against the environmental degradation and the recovery of nature, the nature of the country. So, for example, between 2013 and 2020, 5 million hectares of forests and pastures were planted in the country, generating 1.1 million jobs. More than 1 million people were employed in this work to replant the forest and pastures in Brazil. So imagine what could be a Brazilian program. We have two major problems in the country today. The poverty, we are back in the map of hunger with the pandemic and the lack of government that we have. Today we have 17 million Brazilians that came back to the line of poverty. So we need, as of next year, if everything goes right and if we are able to make our homework, if we can put the country back on the tracks, one of our main tasks would be to fight poverty, and the other would be reforestation. One of the crimes of the current government, exactly, and we know, is the expansion of the Cerrado, the Brazilian savanna, in a rhythm, in a speed that we had never seen before. So a program that puts together fight against poverty and reforestation, this is something that we need to understand more, how the Chinese have done, because this serves perfectly. And the other point has to do with the investment in energy. Curiously, we have just published a report in the Chinese investment in Brazil. China invested $66 billion in Brazil in this period, in the last 13 years. And curiously, more than 70% of these investments, most of them are in energy. The problem is that most of this investment is in mergers and acquisitions and in state-owned companies, previously state-owned companies that have been sold. This would be a problem in itself. China would never do that. They would never sell their state-owned energy companies because it's strategic for a country. But we see that in these investments, China has bought several energy companies, for example, CPFL in São Paulo. But what we have seen, for example, compared to some countries in Latin America, Argentina, for example, recently has closed 2 major agreements of investment in energy with China. One was the Khadraoui Park that was built last year, the largest solar energy park in Latin America, with more than 1 million solar panels. It was an investment of almost $400 million made by China in agreement with the government of Argentina. And recently, they also restarted a project to build the 4th hydropower plant in Argentina called Cucha 3, with investments of $3 billion by the Chinese bank ICBC. In an agreement that was really good for Argentina. They will have 8 years of grace period before they start paying for the loan, generating this is a nuclear plant, nuclear energy. This was a project that started with Cristina Kirchner as president that was not materialized at that time. And now Alberto Fernandes has resumed the negotiation. This virtually everything right to restart construction next year. And we could also mention the case of Bolivia that has recently closed an agreement with China to start processing and trade in lithium. Bolivia today is one of the major sources of this mineral in the world, together with Afghanistan. but China has closed this agreement. Bolivia will stop only exporting and will start processing lithium. And we know that lithium is the very strategic mineral. Most of the batteries will require lithium. So these are three examples of strategic investments that China has been doing with Latin American countries, but countries that have a project and that are sitting down with China for a strategic conversation to discuss national strategic processes, which is what we are lacking exactly. Brazil today, our relationship with China is based in 85% of the cases, soy, oil, ore, and meat. Of course, this generates income, moves the country, but it's very little for countries such as Brazil. We need much more, to be much more ambitious from the point of view of national project than only selling soy, meat, and iron ore to China. So from this point of view, we have examples in Latin America of potential partnerships. And of course, I'm speaking of China because this is the process that I know. And this was my task here, but Brazil must pursue these investments with the United States, with Canada, with Europe, and developed countries. Because of course that Brazil has a gigantic potential. I don't need to tell you how much sun and how much wind we have. I know that we have advanced in these areas of energy in the last years, but it's still possible to make much more than that. So Brazil, yes, has a strategic capacity to produce renewable energies, and probably beyond our borders, we can become a center of production of renewable energies, including playing a more important role in Latin America and in Africa from the point of view of partnerships. But of course that China can become also a strategic partner in this sense with all the accrued experience and due to their commitment as well. Commitment that was declared last year, and it's really interesting when we live in when we follow the debate and the Chinese press. This has become a healthy obsession today for the Chinese, the theme of reducing carbon emissions. And this is the topic of this battle that we have from the global point of view to save the planet and save humankind. So in this sense, it's really interesting to be living here this moment because it's a very rich moment. For us, we have a lot to learn, and also we can also build strategic projects and to give the contribution that we need for the change of this announced tragedy, which is the climate situation in planet Earth. So I'm closing. I thank you once again, and I'm sorry. My brain is almost 4 a.m. It's not working really well right now. Really good, Marco. So only 15 minutes and you can go to bed, okay? I have received several questions here, very specific to go deeper into this debate, but we are going to our final round. We have a final remarks from our speakers. We have 3 minutes for each. So I'm going to ask a very general question, but that was present in your speech, and especially also Marco that talked about the challenges in China. We know that we have the challenge to face inequalities among countries and inequality within countries. We have the inequality between the North and the South Hemisphere, and also inequalities within the countries. To face inequalities means also to include more people so that they can consume more. And then we have the challenge to reduce dramatically our emissions of greenhouse gases, right? So, and I think that Marco has touched on what China is doing. Is it possible to face the challenge of climate change at the same time that you face the challenge of including low-income population, that you reduce inequalities? Or I'm rephrasing the question, are we going to be able to face the challenge of climate change without facing the challenge of inequality?
Of course, it's a big issue, but you have 3 minutes just to give your initial thoughts, but also your concluding remarks, because afterwards, based on what we've already heard from you, we are going to seek you out, pick your brain for our process we are constructing within the Workers' Party of Brazil. So we'll continue with the same order. So David Livingstone, for a 3-minute reply for this question and concluding remarks. Thank you. David, over to you.
Thank you. Could you just repeat the question one more time? I apologize, I didn't catch that.
Não, rapidamente, é possível.
So is it possible to address the challenge of climate change, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases without addressing inequality between nations and within nations? And also, can you tag on your concluding remarks? So you have 3 minutes for the two things, okay? Thank you.
Great. I would reframe the question. What are the opportunities for us to address climate change while creating co-benefits of reducing inequality both globally and domestically within our economy? I would argue that some of the opportunities are self-evident. Some of the opportunities will take further research, reflection, consideration, and conversation amongst groups like this. Evidently, it's a fact that the transition from more polluting fuels to cleaner fuels will change the entire economic structure in some ways of the global energy system. No longer will there be as significant of transfers of wealth from sources that have been endowed by God in geology with fossil resources, hydrocarbons, if you will, and fossil fuels like coal, to those that are major importers of them. But there will be more of an interesting and distributed opportunity to tie into global value chains for clean energy technologies like we see today. Oil that's pumped out of one location and brought and burned in the vehicles of another location might cross borders a handful of times as it goes from crude to refining to petrochemicals, a few other products, and is finally delivered to a storage facility and to the final consumer. But the modern wind turbines that are being erected today offshore our coasts, in our windy hills, in our different regions, the solar panels that are being installed in record numbers, record size in all parts of the world. These are technologies, these are products which cross hundreds of borders sometimes when you count up all the various different inputs that go into them, at least tens of times. So we talk about these global value chains that are going to involve the creation of value and the distribution of value by those who produce them in very different ways than has been typically the case in the past. Secondly, I would argue that we cannot afford not to address climate change, because a world in which we've succumbed to the worst of the climate crisis is a world in which the inequality that we see in the world today is but simply a modest preview of what's to come in a world in which we do not address the worst impacts of climate change. Climate change is an absolute threat multiplier when it comes to our challenges of alleviating poverty, when it comes to reducing inequality within our economies and among our economies. And so the effort to address climate change is inherently an effort to address that exacerbator, that great threat of exacerbating inequality in the years and the decades ahead. Secondly, we also need to make sure that as we benefit from this global energy transition and this different model for the distribution of value, for the creation of value in the global clean energy economy, that we're doing so in a way which creates quality economic opportunities, which upholds human rights, which abides by the principles of responsibility, sustainability, respect for the worker, for the individual that we all subscribe to. And it's for this reason that we're taking steps to make sure that materials that feed into clean energy supply chains, from critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, to the polysilicon and metallurgical grade silicon that was mentioned, which plays such an instrumental role in solar panels, ensuring that these are produced using high quality jobs that create value, that create wages that allow individuals to thrive. And of course, most importantly, uphold our underlying principles of human rights, human dignity, and aren't fed by forced labor or other undesirable practices that we want to make sure are not part of the transition to a cleaner economy, and that don't hold that transition to a cleaner economy hostage. And then finally, I would just note that in greening our financial flows, in creating flows of investment and capital in our people, in the clean energy economy, the greener economy of tomorrow, will hopefully avoid exacerbating some of the traps of pollution and poverty that have been created in the past, when we haven't properly priced or accounted for the externalities, the negative externalities created by the incredibly valuable and dense energy that we've come to grow our modern economies on. But as we transition away from these dense hydrocarbons, these rich and valuable in many ways hydrocarbons, because of those externalities, we need to make sure that economy we build accounts for their pollution, accounts for their negative externalities as we move to cleaner sources, and that we value again that lack of pollution, that cleaner quality in the next energy economy as we make that transition. So I see multiple opportunities there. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen easily, but it defines a work agenda for all of us in the years ahead.
Muito obrigado, David.
Thank you very much, David. Camila, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you, Congressman. Very interesting, the points raised by my fellow panelists. I have learned a lot this afternoon. Trying to answer your question, which is an excellent question. Is it possible to decarbonize and meet climate objectives without combating inequalities? I will try to, in 3 minutes, try to suggest. I think this would require, a lot of debate because it's quite conceptual. Anyway, the logic that rules is like this trade-off logic, in the sense that to fight inequality, it will be necessary to increase people's incomes, poor people's incomes, and this will tend to increase consumption, which can conflict with the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For example, this is a logic that makes sense if there's no structural transformation. So I want to underscore this point, because this is the heart of the matter. The approach of the big push is the transformation. We can't do the things as we used to. So we are talking about changing radically how people and merchandise move around within cities, within countries, between countries, We are talking about a transformation that has to be deep and structural about how we produce, distribute, and consume energy. Without these transformations, these objectives may end up being conflicted, mutually conflicted. I want to emphasize this point because one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is that, of course, reducing economic activity reduces emissions of greenhouse gases, but I'm very critical of this perspective of negative growth. This idea is that you need to stop economic activity in some way for social aims to be met, social targets to be met. Because in a study published by Nature and Climate Change journal, which quantified the reduction of emissions due to the pandemic, the main conclusion of the study was that without structural changes, without investments in transformation, it's not possible to reach a sustainable reduction over time in greenhouse gas emissions. So what is the pivot? So I've already used up my time. So what is it? So these transformations require investment. It's not possible to have transformations without investment. And if we look at the same base of information on climate, the IPCC, which is our technical anchor, looks at the state of the art about global warming. The IPCC tells us that we need a transformation without precedent in all sectors of the economy, increasing significantly the investments in all sectors in a whole menu of mitigation and adaptation possibilities. So this big push of investments necessary to bring about this transformation is compatible with the idea of reducing inequality, of economic reactivation under certain conditions. So I'll conclude with that because this is an absolutely key point that we have been managing to exploit and provide evidence. Low carbon investments will not automatically bring about inequality. They need to be made under certain conditions. They must be accompanied by certain policies. And I think David brought the example of the initiative of Justice 40, which is a mechanism of the Biden plan that seeks explicitly to direct at least 40% of investment to most vulnerable communities, to marginalized communities. So there are mechanisms that can be conceived, created for these objectives to be compatible. So they can be made compatible. It depends on the construct of how it will be done. Thank you. Thank you, Camila. Now I invite Said for his reply and concluding remarks. Said, please.
Thank you, Nilto. Well, it's the key question, I think. But I believe that without support of people, the necessary transition will simply not happen. The transition will have to be just, or it will just not happen, as we say here in Europe. It's not easy. It's about a systemic change. Almost the whole system, the whole economy needs to be made different, you know, in a few decades only. And that's why actually we need to ensure that the social dimension, issues of inequalities, are actually addressed in the design of climate policies from day one. Not later try to fix things. We need to think it through from day one. Otherwise, we will not get there. And if people feel abandoned or excluded, they will simply oppose change. Because the climate transition will be about a lot of changes that if you do not bring people on board, help them not only to understand, but also be part of this change and help them also to benefit from this change. I think that's the crucial thing. And it also needs to be made very concrete to people. It's not only about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually about transforming the way of life. It's about better housing. And it creates a lot of co-benefits. If we do it well, investing in social housing, for instance, can create local jobs, whilst at the same time reduce emissions. When you redesign the mobility system, it can not only reduce emissions because you have less polluting cars, but it also increases the health benefits. It can reduce traffic accidents and so much more, right? So I think that's the crucial thing. And it's always difficult to explain the how, but I think one of the ways is to engage with people, to consider the climate transition as a societal project, right? It's not only about technology, it's not only about regulations. It's actually a kind of a people's transformation of society that we need to do together. And of course, the same applies somehow at the global level. I mean, the EU emits today only 8% of global emissions. So it would be stupid for the EU only to look inwards and try to solve its own problems without looking to what happens elsewhere. As I said at the very beginning, we're in it together, and we need to, transform this global economy together. And I agree with David that it's also a unique opportunity for countries to develop another type of economy, not to do the same mistakes as the industrial nations did. We can help countries to leapfrog over polluting infrastructure, use new technologies to avoid the mistakes we did in Europe when industrializing in the past. So it's a new type of growth also, I think. And this implies, for instance, also a discussion about how to assess what is economic success. It's a bit a discussion about the GDP. You know, by now we all understand that GDP growth does not cover very important things like the quality of life, environmental, social success. All these things also requires to be reconsidered, I think, and this needs to be done also at the global level. The final point I want to make is that I am quite optimistic. I see also, despite all the challenges and the difficulties, also in the context of the COVID crisis, I see also a unique momentum, right? The US is back in the game. China has high ambitions, even though it will not be easy to get there. The European Union is very committed. Japan, Korea also announced that they want to become climate neutral by 2050. And we hope that also in Brazil, change will come soon. And that other countries will join the kind of leading coalition. And the COP26 that will take place in November could be a unique opportunity to shape the agenda for the forthcoming years, accelerate the ambition following the cry that we saw from the IPCC report to do something soon. And also, of course, discuss very complex issues. It's not all, it will not be an easy game. What does it mean for trade, for instance? How can we price carbon? Can we do this in a fair way? These are very complex discussions, but we need to have these discussions because otherwise we will never get there. So that's my final point. Thank you again. It was very interesting, and let's keep in touch.
Muito obrigado, Said. Marco, suas considerações finais. Muito obrigado, Marco.
Vou ser rapidinho para eu poder ir para a cama logo. Bom, primeiro agradecer mais uma vez essa oportunidade de estar aqui, de ouvir contribuições.
First of all, I want to thank once again the opportunity to be here and to hear the relevant contributions of such important people. I really like Said's talk, because we must, in fact, reflect on these mistakes, what mistakes we have made as humankind so far, that have brought us to this point of the humankind threatened. This is a fact. If we continue as we are in 30 years, things will become even more serious. And we need a deep transformation. Camila has also touched on that. We are talking of a logic. The logic that has brought us so far is a logic that we already know, of the profit, of maximization of profits, regardless the externalities that these profits will generate. And these externalities now are being, and now we have to pay back for these externalities. And this topic is very much related to the sustainability of the planet, which is the production of food. The way in which we produce food today is also destroying the planet. We have not touched on that today, but we cannot discuss climate change and sustainability without also rediscussing the model of food production, and then the contribution of Via Campesina is extremely important to show these contradictions, the contradictions that we see that are so much flared in Brazil. The production of food through the agribusiness model not only destroys the forests, polluting the waters and the earth, but also generating all sorts of diseases for the population, increase in cancer rates, which is something that is global, that is scientifically proved to be very much related to industrialized foods and the way that we consume foods. So finally, maybe the good signs of reaching this extreme situation that we are is the possibility of rethinking the model of organization in our society, and what is the logic that is going to determine how we produce our products and how we consume. So we cannot think on how to save the planet without rethinking this model of the last 250 years of industrial civilization that now needs to be rethought. So in this sense, the role of popular organizations, movements, the parties that are committed to this transformation, as it is the case of the Workers' Party and other parties around the world. This is the moment to rethink about that in global forums, in global spaces connected not only to the question of climate change, but also to all the model of living in a society, so that we don't make the same mistakes that we have in the last 200 years. Thank you, Camila, David, Said, Marco. I'm sure that after we have the transcribed all of these documents, all of these talks, we are going to get in touch with you. I want to thank Chris, Gonzalo, all the team of Friedrich Ebert Foundation for the partnership. I want to thank Agnes, that has given so much support to us, all the team of the Center of political policies. We are closing a cycle of debate. I want to thank Perseu Abramo Foundation. We have several brothers and sisters that have taken over the responsibility and has helped us to organize this debate. So my gratitude to each one of you. And with that, I want to also thank the translators who have participated today. We had several other activities, and this possibility of working with translators really helped. So all the communication team of the Workers' Party, specifically Gilmar Tatto, the secretary, who has been innovating with PTTV. And I can tell you that we are so proud of Lula has been giving a lot of press conferences in his tour to the northeast of Brazil. And then we have there PTTV. We are very proud of it. PT in Brazil is a Workers' Party. So we want to thank you, all of you who participated and attended. So our challenge now is to organize this, to face the challenges that we have ahead of us. Because hopefully we are going to get back into the leadership of the country, and we are going to face these central challenges, the challenge of inequality, social inclusion, but at the same time playing our role, taking over our responsibility to tackle this challenge that affects all of us in the planet. How do we do to eliminate this threat to our lives in the planet? So I wish a wonderful rest of the day. Those of you who are here with us, please share. Thank you very much. Goodbye.